Hello, welcome to today's edition of the Academy. Now we're going to start a slightly different series of videos. These will probably be a little bit shorter, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But what I had been doing up to this point is covering some general concepts that are prominent in today's military theory. Is published in many different volumes, current military thought and what have you, and how they apply to the tabletop. Well, I still want to do the same thing, except I thought, instead of just sticking with what I had been doing, it seemed to relate to the work first published by Clausewitz a few hundred years ago. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It makes a whole lot of sense. But what I don't want to do, is to make this Academy series seem like it's one-sided or one flavor. As I mentioned, there's military thought across the spectrum of military combat. You got land warfare, you've got grand strategy in total, you've got air combat, sea combat, naval combat. It's all over, and I didn't want to stay, focus on one to give anybody the impression that that's all I'm caring about. So let's change it up a little bit, and let's bring up Sun Tzu, which is an extremely popular theorist. Some of the there's, I guess in my personal observation, it seems we in the West seem to have this fascination with everything Oriental. Hence, Oriental martial arts are always, quote, better than European martial arts and what have you. When in reality, martial arts are just that. They're an art, combat art. And just like in gaming, what matters is how the practitioner uses it against his opponent. There is no one is better than the other. If that were the case, we wouldn't have all these different schools, even in the Oriental arts, vying for people's interest. So if we strip off just the fascination some of us in the West have for things that are Oriental, and just look at Sun Tzu just as a strategist, ignore the fact he's from China, we can actually be amazed at something that really stunned me. I got my copy of Sun Tzu and realized that if this had been a book in print, I think a comic book might have been bigger. And that's not a bad thing in this case. But what it showed me was it startled me into a sense of reality here. Where Sun Tzu excelled is where a lot of us, including myself, fall flat. That is being very succinct, to the point, and concise. Some of his commentators have said terse. Terse generally nowadays has a negative connotation, but he is very, very short. It's 13 chapters long. Now you look at most books that are 13 chapters, and you're talking a few hundred pages. But this 13 chapters, in a Word document that I recently downloaded, amounts to 22 pages. And this isn't an abbreviated version. This is just the English translation of his. Now what's interesting is, 13 chapters. The first chapter, just to give you an example of how this is done, has a grand total of what I will call verses. Okay, there's 26 of them, only 26. Those are usually one sentence. So in a few, he's got maybe a couple other sentences. A couple of these verses are 2 or maybe 3 sentences. So there might be 35 sentences in the first chapter. Some books have 35 paragraphs in the first chapter, so that's a huge difference. And it speaks to his ability to communicate. And so I think that is actually very good. I want to try to not be too wordy on these particular videos dealing with Sun Tzu. I kind of want to honor that point. So I'm not going to expound on what he says, but I am going to try to take the various blurbs he has, the concepts, and I will apply those to the tabletop. Now, what I noticed is a lot of what he wrote deals with not fighting. In fact, the best generals don't fight. You find a way of defeating your opponent without combat. Of course, if we did that, most board games would be very boring, right? So I went through, and for each chapter, I've identified certain points I'm going to highlight. And these videos will not be one chapter per video. They're going to be one concept per video. In this first of the series, we're starting with the first chapter, which is called Laying Plans. And in this chapter, he starts off by essentially talking about just what is the sphere of military science. Where are the things you have to consider and study, and then he goes into what does he's again writing this treatise for his ruler. So he's really addressing it to him. He's giving him advice about how he should select and retain generals. So of course that doesn't apply in this case. And then he goes on to a lot of concepts dealing with deception, which I've always kind of wanted to touch on. So I think instead of having a separate deception video, I'll cover the concept through my Sun Tzu pieces here. All right, so we're going to start with chapter 1, chapter 1, laying plans. We're only going to cover really verse. Again, I don't know if this is the right terms. I've not found anyone who's actually labeled these new numbered passages as anything more than a sentence. I don't know if they're sentences or verses or whatever. So I'm going to call them verses for now. And it's 4 through 9. Okay, they're all essentially all about the art of war. There's 5 constant factors in the art of war. Okay, so we'll start today with there's 5 that he represents: the moral law, the heaven, the earth, commander, and method and discipline. Okay, they have various implications in the tabletop. Okay, moral law is I don't know where the Chinese roots come from the words that came up to translate into moral law, but the concept he's looking at essentially is making sure the people and the ruler are of like mind, and they find that there is a value and a need to engage in the conflict. That way, when the ruler is commanding the army to go do, they see the value in it, and they buy into the concept of potentially sacrificing their life for the Tao reference here, but the greater good of the state. And you'll see that actually that concept of warfare is an arm of diplomatic. A diplomatic arm of the state. It's using muscle, if you will, brute force, to accomplish the political will of the state. So that's the highest level of strategy. In the process of diving down into the details of tactics, you have to go through some of these layers, and some of these concepts come out. So moral law doesn't really apply well on tabletop. Your models are going to do what you tell them to do because they don't have a will of their own. They're inanimate. Duh. But it is kind of represented in most game systems through some sort of a morale value. It could be a leadership value, it could be a break value. It could be called morale. Okay, and that is how well a force, a unit, actually it's usually a unit, will stick around under the stress of combat. And part of it is the training, discipline. Part of it is how well are they buying into the call. So a levy is not going to stick around as long as a veteran, or even a recruit. Okay. Now, I think I will go ahead and actually read his verses out. This is an English translation of the verses. And so, the moral law causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler, so that they will follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. Okay, so that's what his concept is. That's as far as he covers moral law. Very succinct, to the point. And I think that's where a lot of people get hung up. Sun Tzu is really easy to read. I really recommend everyone gets it, simply because the concepts are so right there in front of you. Don't read too much into it. There's several commentaries, many from Chinese, I would say contemporaries, but they're actually from several centuries afterward, during that period. And there's a couple modern ones. And the good ones don't embellish what he said. The good ones simply try to tell you what he meant by the particular statement. Okay. Verse 7 talks about the heaven component. And heaven signifies night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons. That's it, one sentence. Now, in many game systems, these are actually factored into certain scenarios and certain optional rules. For example, in the old squad leader rule set, whether it was advanced squad leader or even the rewrite of it, you actually had some environmental weather factors that played into it. You had fog, rain, mud, all those things. Those actually played into the battlefield mechanics. In 40K right now, the only thing they've got is night fighting, and that's only for one turn, possibly, maybe, half the games. I prefer running scenarios that incorporate some of these rules, maybe especially for that scenario. There are a lot of campaigns in the Imperial Armor list books that actually introduce some of these other factors, wind, blizzard conditions, and what have you. I've seen some really good scenarios where those play into it. Apocalypse has environmental factors in the Master Disaster thing. So, of course, that's not quite the same because that is actually more damaging to your units than interfering with their abilities. Now, you need to, again, the point he's trying to make with these, lining these things out is the general has to study these so that he understands how they impact his ability, his troops' ability to accomplish the mission that he has ahead of him. Okay, the 8th verse is the earth. It says, Earth comprises distances, great and small, danger and security, open ground and narrow passes, the chances of life and death. That's the statement. Now, initially I thought, well, this is just terrain, but it's more than actually terrain. It's all about ranges, open space, line of sight blocking stuff, terrain, that it affects movement and as it affects visibility. It's the setting of your battlefield, okay, the physical one. And the dangers relate to the topographical dangers from what I understand in here. So that's your dangerous terrain type checks, or potentially situations like if you're crossing a river, there's a chance a unit may founder and drown or get disrupted in different game systems. Those are the kind of things that, and again, you have to, as a general, you're trying to study these things, these earth things, and understand how they would affect your units and how your units would have to deal with them. The 4th one is the commander, and in verse 9 he says, the commander stands for the virtues of wisdom, sincerely, benevolence, courage, and strictness. Now you put these in a certain order. In the case of, most of these are literally the interaction between the commander and his troops. It doesn't really play on the battlefield. The wisdom and sincerity is, it's sound thinking is what the wisdom really reflects here. Good judgment, and how the choices he makes are going to affect his men. Okay, you don't want to get too hooked up with emotionally with the fact that your men are going to go forward and die. You're commanding them to go out and get killed. That's part of the nature of being a general. But you don't want to do that foolishly. You don't want to squander it. You want to make sure you value their lives. Minimize the casualties. Okay. All war has casualties. All commanders are going to send men to their death. Okay. That's just the way it is. But you need to do it wisely. Get the maximum reward for what you do spend in life. Now, the benevolence side of things is courage and strictness. That's all. None of that is actually modeled in the game terms. Even games I've played, board games and what have you, such as like Squad Leader, Panzer Leader, those hex map type games, they don't represent this either. It's very hard to do. The most it gets represented is on the discipline side, where if you've got a strict military discipline in the army or that portion of the army, those units tend to have a higher morale value. Okay, representing their ability to follow orders and know the consequences are grave if they don't. Right. So the only other piece here that really does stand out on the tabletop is courage. Now, it's not that we have to be, as the generals of our armies, courageous in the face of danger. It's we have to be courageous on the tabletop. So, is this a situation that we're about to, where are we gonna be cautious and worried, or are we gonna brash? Are we gonna try no risk, no reward kind of thing? Go big or go home. Those kind of concepts. Now, again, you got to temper the courage with the wisdom side of things. But that courage aspect comes into play very well on the tabletop. You have to take risks. You have to do gambles. You have to make choices and hopefully pick the one that's going to give you the biggest payoff. And oftentimes, the safer route isn't the biggest payoff or the best path to success. You have to be a little more courageous. You might look at it as aggressive, but again, aggressive can be taken too far. So I think courageous is probably a better term than aggressiveness. So those are the first verses that I'm going to cover. And again, the idea here, I did forget one, I'm sorry. The last one is method and discipline. Method and discipline, again, does not really apply to the tabletop because it's more about the logistics of gathering and moving your army and supplying it. Not something that's really well represented in most gaming systems. There are some campaigns in some gaming systems I've seen where they do factor some level of logistics in. But this is what Sun Tzu actually wrote. So by method and discipline are to be understood the marshaling of the army in its proper subdivisions, the graduations of rank among the officers, the maintenance of roads by which supplies may reach the army, and the control of military expenditure. None of this is on the tabletop. Okay, so I won't cover that aspect, but I do want to mention that this piece is an example of how a lot of military thought texts don't apply directly to the tabletop. And so sometimes you'll read through some of these and you'll see these statements. You'll say, well, none of this is going to matter to me. And you just kind of throw out the whole document. So of these 5, 3 of them make a lot of sense, are well represented on the tabletop in one way or another. One of them, heaven, is not as well represented, but still, that's 3 of 5 that are. So we can actually study, as gaming generals, what are the effects in my chosen game system of the weather and the season, the environment. How can I effectively operate my chosen army within that game system under these different conditions? So play games with the different rules in play. The more you learn that, the more often you're going to excel, because you'll see things that you'll actually be able to benefit from. Earth, okay, again, it's all about the terrain and the physical distances and types of obstacles on the battlefield you're facing. Study those. Study things like field of fire, intervening terrain, blocking terrain, all types of. Just study those. Try different boards of different terrain densities. Get good at all of them. Okay, people complain about you put too much terrain on, and then shooty armies are disadvantaged against close combat armies. You put too little on, it's the other way around. It's like, shouldn't matter. You need to learn how to handle, if you're a shooting army, obviously open line of sight's better for you, but you need to learn how to identify those killing zones in built up areas. And if you're a close combat army, you need to learn how to figure out how to cover open ground quickly or utilize existing line of sight blocking terrain to ensure most of your units survive as much as possible to get to the enemy lines. Practice. And the commander, that's all about you. And again, the keys here are the wisdom, good judgment, and courage. Brash, I don't want to use aggressive, but it's about you as the general. How good are you going to be? And one of the themes that Sun Tzu points out in this first chapter, and in fact through many of his his comments and chapters, is a good general practices. What more can be said? If you want to be good at your chosen game, practice. If you run into situations where you think were unfair to your army, don't whine. Practice it. Find the ways to take that disadvantaged position and turn it around. You're not always going to have the ideal position with your ideal army the way you'd want it. You have to be able to adapt to those. Okay, so that's Sun Tzu's first just a few verses within his first chapter. In the next video, we'll talk about, again, still in the laying plans chapter 1, we'll talk more on things around deception. Okay, see you in the next video. Thanks for sticking around. Please share, like, and subscribe, and enjoy. Bye-bye.